Hello and welcome to the people in the room and the people online. We are about to begin. So it's always exciting to present people, but it's never more exciting than I get to present Kimmo Eriksson, who's my longtime collaborator, all around fantastic researcher, presenting the first study of our new network on global social norms. We will have a short seminar and then there will be time for questions. If you are online, you can tap in questions in the chat and I will deliver them for you. And without much further ado, I leave it over to Kimmo.
Thank you. So it's a great honor to me to present this global study of everyday norms because it's arguably the most global study of social norms ever done. And this is thanks to a collaborative effort of more than 160 researchers throughout the world. This has been made possible financially through a grant to Pontus from the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, and organizationally through this initiative called the Global Social Norms Research Network. So this is a research network that is hosted here at the Institute for Future Studies. Its aim is to study social norms across the globe. And you can visit our website at www.globalsocialnorms.org. And if perhaps you're interested in collecting data, joining this research network, you just contact us. So last year, Pontus and I decided that we were going to use these networks to study everyday norms. And everyday norms is a concept that comes from a study by two social psychologists, Price and Bouffard, 50 years ago. So they thought that they could get a grip of how much people agree on what is appropriate behavior in different situations by simply asking people, how appropriate is it to do this behavior in this situation, or this behavior in this situation, and so on. And they chose particularly common behaviors taken from diaries of students and common situations also taken from these diaries of students. So they asked students, what did you do yesterday and where were you? And they created these common situations and common behaviors, and then they checked which common behaviors are appropriate in which situation. So these are social norms, and as all other social norms, they are important in practice to people's lives because, if you violate a social norm, you might get social sanctions. So here are a few of the things that we have studied. Is it okay to kiss on the sidewalk? Is it okay to be loud in the office? Is it okay to read the newspaper at the movies? So all of these are common behaviors in common situations, but not all behaviors are okay in every situation. And these are some questions you can ask about everyday norms. Are they generally stricter in certain societies, or does it depend on the behavior? So the only previous global study of everyday norms was performed by Michelle Galfand and her co-authors in a paper published 2011. And the object of that paper was to show that there are indeed some societies where social norms are generally stricter. That was called tighter societies. But in that study, they didn't look at how much this depended on which behavior, which situation you were in, but just the overall tightness. So, how much do these norms actually depend on which behavior we're looking at? Second question, how big are these differences across societies? Are they large or small? So you can have very different priori conceptions of this. If you think of the game theory idea of norms, for instance, is that a norm is an equilibrium in a coordination game. So any equilibrium would be a potential norm. So we could see just very, very different norms out there, depending on which equilibrium society ended up in. You can also just think that cultural norms comes because of these absolutely unpredictable cultural quirks. You can only understand a society on that society's terms, so any society could have whichever social norms they have completely different to other societies. So that's one potential possibility. Another possibility is that norms generally come from just a few underlying principles that are sort of universal, so that we should expect the same behaviors to be appropriate or inappropriate in different countries. So, how large or small are these norms differences? We don't know that before. And how much do these everyday norms vary across situations? So usually when you study norms, it's just a behavior you're looking at. But here we're looking at behaviors and situations at the same time. And when you leave norms and just look at how do people react to different situations, that is an established field in social psychology called studying the situationism of a society. So, how much do the norms vary across situations, and does that vary across societies? And what we're most interested in perhaps is, can we formulate a theory that actually manages to explain the answers to these questions? And this is a theory that Pontus and I have been working on for several years. It's called the moral flavors theory of norms. And the idea here is that norms, to a large extent, are shaped by just two things. One thing at the society level, namely the society's moral taste buds, and another thing at the behavior level, namely the behavior's moral flavor. So I'll just give you an example straight away. Fairness is an aspect of behaviors. Some behaviors are unfair, some behaviors are fair. Fairness can be more important in some societies than others. And then, in that case, we would expect social norms to be stricter against particularly unfair behaviors. So that's the moral flavor of the behavior, whether it's unfair or not. They should be particularly strict in societies for which fairness is more important. So, the violation is is an aspect of the behavior, and the taste for that is an aspect of the society. Here's another example, loyalty. You can think of some societies where loyalty is important, other societies where loyalty is not important, and there are also some behaviors that violate loyalty and some behaviors that are loyal. So then we would expect particularly disloyal behaviors to be strong norms in societies where you think that loyalty is important. Okay, so this is a very simple idea. So what should you do to test it? Well, there are 3 steps you need to do. First, identify what these relevant moral flavors and taste buds are. So here are 2 examples, fairness and loyalty. Is that exhaustive, or how many are there? And then we need to measure for every behavior its moral flavor. And we need to measure for every society its moral taste buds. But once we have those measures, we should then be able to say which norms we have for a given behavior in a given society. So the first task then is the identification of these moral flavors and taste buds. And here we can use a framework called moral foundation theory that has outlined 6 different, they call it moral foundations, but in fact it will work both as flavors and as taste buds. So for instance, people tend to like that behaviors are caring. If it's not caring, if it's harmful, then that's a moral flavor of the behavior. And some societies might think that harmful behaviors are very important for their norms, and other societies not. And the other foundations are fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and purity and sanctity. So what do we know about these things? Well, we know that from our prior work, mine and Pontus, that behaviors can violate one of these and not the others. So you need all 6 of these to pinpoint the moral flavors of behaviors. Some behaviors are disloyal, they don't have any other problem. Some behaviors are unfair, they don't have any other problem, so on. But on the taste bud side, it seems that it's enough to look at just one dimension. because this is moral foundations research showing that people who tend to think that care is important also tend to think that fairness and liberty is very important, and that loyalty, authority, and purity, sanctity is not very important. So most of the differences in moral taste buds between people seem to be captured just by how much they prioritize individualizing moral flavors compared to binding. So in the American context, you call these liberals, those who think that individualizing are much more important than binding, and conservatives, those that think that the binding ones are as important as the individualizing ones. Okay, so to apply these then to everyday concerns, we need to map what people think is problematic about everyday behaviors to this moral framework. But if you ask people, they would typically not use these formal moral words to describe what is problematic with everyday behaviors. So Pontus and I and Irina, we have spent maybe 2 years of lots and lots of pilot studies trying to pinpoint how people actually think about what's wrong with everyday behaviors when they are wrong. And we have sort of managed to distill that most of what people think is wrong can be categorized into just 3 categories. And these 3 are examples of these categories. So the first one is, what's wrong? For those people who think that it's wrong kissing on the street, it's that this is a behavior belonging to the category vulgar. So that we call coarse or filthy or sexually explicit. And you can think of many other kinds of behaviors, like in addition to kissing, that fit that description. And that violates one of the moral foundations, namely the purity one. Okay, so that's good. When people say that that's the concern they have, we should think of it as a violation of a binding foundation. A second problem that people have with these everyday behaviors are that some of them are inconsiderate, like shouting in the office. Inconsiderate in the sense having negative consequences for people around you. And that clearly violates care for other people. So that's an individualizing foundation that's being violated. What about the last one? So that's the one we have most trouble thinking about. Why do people think that it's inappropriate to read the newspaper at the movies? Because that doesn't disturb anyone else and it doesn't seem to be vulgar. So we have found out that it seems to be captured by the idea that the behavior simply lacks sense. Now, why did you go to the movies if you wanted to read the newspaper? That seems to detract both from the newspaper reading and from the movie watching. So it doesn't have positive consequences for the actor to do this. Now, observe that lacking sense also violates care. From my point of view, if I see that person shouting, he disturbs other people. If I see that person reading newspaper, he doesn't take care of himself instead. Namely, it has negative consequences for him. So both of these are about consequences, just for different actors. And hence, it's an individualizing foundation. Right? So then we are armed with the theory and with the concerns that we hope to be mapped into this theory. So now let's see if we can model how everyday norms should be predicted by the moral flavors theory. So we want to predict the norm strength in a given society for a given situated everyday behavior. Here we have a situated everyday behavior. It could be that this is vulgar. People have concerns about vulgarity, so that would give it there should be a stronger norms to that compared to a behavior that is not vulgar. Okay, it's a very first simple prediction. We can also measure how inconsiderate the situated behavior is. And we predict that the more inconsiderate it is, the stronger the norm will be. And there will be very different behaviors that are inconsiderate to those that are vulgar. But both of them should have norms. And we can measure how much it seems to lack sense. And the more it lacks sense, we should also think that it should be a stronger norm to it. So all of this is just about which behaviors do we think there will be strong norms against. The second question is, how does that depend on the society? And according to our theory, there's just one dimension to think about here, namely how liberal the moral priorities of the society is, how much it prioritizes the individualizing concerns compared to the binding concerns. So the first thing then is that liberals think that vulgarity is less important because it's a binding consideration. So that should make this arrow less strong, weaker. But liberals think that individualizing concerns are more important, so these two arrows should become stronger. So we should see a greater effect of inconsiderateness on norm strength in liberal societies. And finally, we should see a main effect. Because one of the things that liberals are concerned about is liberty itself. So if you think that liberty is important, you should think that it's bad to constrain people's behavior. That is, you would prefer having weaker norms. So the same societies that on general don't like strong norms should like to have stronger norms, particularly for behaviors that violate inconsiderateness or lacking sense. So that's the model. And first I want to underscore how parsimonious this is. Because think of this, that in our study we have 150 situated behaviors. I'll show you soon which they are. And we have 90 societies. So that means we're trying to predict 13,500 societal norms. But to predict those, we only use 3 variables per behavior, that's 450, plus 1 variable per each society, that's 90. So altogether 540 numbers. So using 540 numbers, we're going to try to predict 13,500 different norms. So with our 160 collaborators, we managed to conduct a study in 90 societies that has altogether about 25,000 participants, both students and non-students. And one thing we checked is that we get the same results in among students and non-students. So we don't need to worry about that. The red colored countries here are the countries that we are covering. So you can see that we cover most of the world, and compared to other studies of this kind, we're most proud of this, that we have covered so much of Africa, which is studies typically find very problematic. So the first thing we need to measure then is the liberalness of society's moral priorities. And we do this with a newly developed scale. We could also have used the Moral Foundations questionnaire that the Moral Foundations research have used. And indeed, we included that too. But we prefer this one because it goes straight at what we want to measure, namely ask people how they prioritize between individualizing concerns and binding concerns. So one item here would be this. What's the right thing to do in a situation when you must either restrict others' freedom or violate a religious rule? And then here they prioritize between liberty then and purity, sanctity. And the scale is from 1 to 5. So that means that we get a theoretical range here between 1 if they always prioritize binding, or 5 if they always prioritize individualizing. And this is what the results look like. So we have countries like Sweden and Finland get very close to the top mark here. That is, they all people in these countries almost always prioritize individualizing over binding foundations. And then at the opposite end, we have countries like, this is Saudi Arabia over there. Yeah. So countries that sometimes slightly more prioritize binding to individualizing. That means that one thing that we can say here is that there's a clear bias, if you look at the world as a whole, towards prioritizing individualizing foundations, that almost all countries here are on the light side. Next thing is to have these behaviors that we want to measure the norms for. So here we follow this classic study by Price and Bouffard. Take 15 common behaviors. It's essentially the same behaviors that Price and Bouffard used. We have updated it with a few new ones. Using a mobile phone and listening to music on headphones didn't exist in the early 70s. And we also included resting as an interesting behavior that they didn't have. But essentially the same behaviors that have been used before. And also 10 situations that have been used before in this for this kind of studies. A good thing with that is that they have already been validated in the Gelfand study 20 years ago, that we know that these are situations and behaviors that are, in fact, well known and valid across societies. And then we make all possible combinations of behaviors and situations. So, laughing in the public park, laughing in a restaurant, crying in the public park, crying in a restaurant, and so on. So we want to measure what of all of these situated behaviors, how appropriate are they, and what concerns do they elicit. So here are the concerns. So we asked people, if someone disapproves of this behavior, what would be their main problem with it? And we have the vulgarity, inconsiderateness, lacking sense, or something else, or I don't think anyone would disapprove. And these are the proportions who chose vulgarity. This is the top one, kissing in a job interview. That's highly vulgar. Compared to, for instance, singing in a public park. No one thinks that's vulgar. Okay, what is the most inconsiderate behavior? In this study was talking at the movies. So we all know how irritating it is if people sitting next to you are talking at the movies. Some people certainly do, but we others think they are irritating. It is not inconsiderate to cry at the funeral ceremony, for instance. And what behaviors lack sense? We already know that reading the newspaper at the movies lacks sense. Another one is singing in a job interview. That might be nice to the people who is interviewing you, but they still lack sense because they will probably think that you are crazy and not give you the job, right? So these lack sense compared to, for instance, kissing in a public park. Makes perfect sense. Some people might think it's vulgar, but it makes perfect sense. But then we have this assumption that these the concerns themselves should not depend on the society we are in. It's how the concerns are valued that should depend on the society. So, supporting that this is approximately correct, we took the measures in the global north. Half of the societies belong to the global north, and the same measures in the global south, and they're almost perfectly correlated. So, people in the global north and global south both agree that kissing in a job interview is vulgar, and that resting at the movies is not, and so on. And now we come to the important, the actual dependent variable. What are the norms? So for all of these situated behaviors, we just asked, how appropriate or inappropriate is this on a scale from extremely inappropriate to extremely appropriate? And this is the big result from this data collection. So every row represents a society. Every row represents a column. And we have painted these cells blue, dark blue if there's a strong norm against it, and light yellow if it's perfectly appropriate. There's no norm against it. So here's one example. That yellow dot there represents singing at the funeral in Namibia. So that row is Namibia, that column is singing at the funeral. So just looking at this diagram, you can already see some interesting features. One is that there is much more variation across behaviors than across countries, right? We have those really inappropriate behaviors and these really appropriate behaviors. But if we fix a behavior and look at the variation, see that that's not much. What variation there is tends to be that these societies down here are lighter colors though, so they have slightly weaker norms than those societies up here. And that holds for most behaviors, but if you look carefully, not over here. Here we actually have a darker square here than here, which means that these behaviors that typically have weak norms have especially strong norms for the most inappropriate behaviors. Right, so that's data, and we now want to see, can we predict this with our model? So this was our model. And the results look like this. So at the top we have the LMP, the liberal moral priorities. As expected, that has a negative effect. That means overall norms are weaker in more liberal societies. Then we have the effects of the concerns. As expected, every concern makes for stronger norms. And then we have the most important thing, the interactions. As expected, liberal societies have less of an effect of vulgarity, but stronger effects of inconsiderateness and lacking sense. And using this model, we explain 81% of the variation across these 13,500 combinations of situations, behaviors, and societies. So an extremely high level of explanatory power. Here's some illustrations to show you the success. We're going to look first at the society level. So this is the overall norm strength averaged across all those 150 situated behaviors. Do we manage to predict this using the liberal moral priorities? Yes. Really, really well. Down here we have Sweden and Finland. They are very morally liberal and they also have the weakest norms. Up here we have Saudi Arabia, the least liberal and the strongest norms. Okay, looking at the global norms instead. So now we average across all countries instead. And look, so every dot is a situated behavior. So down here we have the global norm strength. And here we have how much concern they elicit. And you can see that the sum of concerns is an almost perfect predictor of the global norm. Right? And then this illustrates that with the liberalness on the x-axis, the effect of vulgarity goes down in more liberal countries, but the effect of inconsiderateness and lacking sense goes up. So all of these concerns matter, but they matter to different degrees depending on how liberal the society is. We can also look for support for this theory in another way. So here we have studied everyday norms, but the theory is clearly made to understand moral norms. So if it works for everyday norms, we should see that moral norms and everyday norms are connected across societies. So the moral norms we didn't measure in this study, but they are measured in, for instance, the World Value Survey. So here are two examples. In the World Value Survey, they ask, how justifiable or unjustifiable is it with sex before marriage and beating children? They have a list of 19 like this, but let's focus on these two. So, sex before marriage. The concern here is clearly a binding one. This is the vulgarity problem, or what would you call it, purity problem. Whereas the problem with beating children is an individualizing concern, is that it violates care for these children. So then if we look at an everyday norm that, like flirting on the sidewalk, which is also a vulgarity concern, we should see that it varies across societies in the same way as sex before marriage does. Which it does. But it varies in the opposite way with beating children. So, societies where strong norms against beating children are the same societies that have weak norms against flirting on the sidewalk. And we can also look at some moral behavior, everyday behavior that has individualizing concerns. One of them is bargaining at a funeral. Is one of those that have very, very high inconsiderateness concerns. And then you see that things flip over. So it's the same countries that have strong norms against sex before marriage that has weak norms against bargaining at the funeral. Whereas inappropriate to bargain at the funeral are the same societies where it's bad to beat children. So indeed we see that we have these very strong connections between moral norms and everyday norms, which is difficult to see why it would happen unless we have this, the moral judgments behind both. Okay, so let's return to our original set of questions. Are everyday norms generally stricter in certain societies? Yes, because it seems that certain societies value liberty more than others. But does it depend on the behavior? Yes, that too, because those liberal societies also think that inconsiderateness is especially bad. Are societal differences in everyday norms large or small? Well, we've already seen that compared to the variation across behaviors, it's ridiculously small differences between the societies. And our theory gives us an explanation for that, namely that it's the same concerns behind these norms in different societies. They only value them a little bit differently, the various concerns, but it's the same concerns you see, and they all think that they are important. So this means that, put me down in some random spot on Earth, and I can probably go around and presume that my everyday behavior that I'm used to will work there too. Do you think? But what about dress codes, for instance? Well, we haven't looked at dress codes here, right? This is just about common behaviors in common situations. So there will be other things that this does not work for. Right, so next question. How much do the everyday norms vary across situations? So this you can see in this graph. Here we have the behaviors and the situations on different axes. So then you can see, if we just look at one, reading the newspaper. So reading the newspaper is okay in a public park. It's not okay at a party. It's okay at the sidewalk. It's not so okay at the restaurant. It's very okay at the bus. Shouldn't probably do it at the workplace. Definitely not at the movies. But it's okay in the library and so on. So situations can be very powerful constraints on where it's okay to read the newspaper, for instance. And our explanation is that, well, different situations create different concerns. So let's look at the concerns for reading the newspaper. Here are, this shows that the norm strength is particularly high for reading the newspaper at the funeral. But we can also see what the problem is. The problem is yellow, namely that reading the newspaper at the funeral is inconsiderate to the other people at the funeral. Compared to the problem with reading the newspaper as a job interview, which is almost as inappropriate. But here the problem is that it lacks sense. So it's not that it disturbs other people, but it disturbs your chances of getting a job, so on. So different concerns might apply in different situations, but they all contribute to the norm strength. And the final question was this: is the situational dependence stronger in certain societies? So we measured the situational dependence by just how much of the variance of all these norms is not explained just by differences between the behaviors. So the situational dependence varies between 50% and 80% in different societies. And it's not very well, but at least fairly well explained by how liberal the societies are. So every dot here is society. So it seems that more liberal societies tend to have stronger situational dependence. And that can also be explained by the moral flavors theory. Because then we say that the moral flavors theory say that we should reduce norms to the concerns and how you value them. And different concerns have very different situational variance. Vulgarity is almost not depending on what situation you are in. Kissing is sort of inherently vulgar, sexually explicit, for instance. Whereas reading a newspaper, we saw that it's inconsiderate in some situations, but not in others. So inconsiderateness and lacking sense strongly depend on the situation, but vulgarity doesn't. And that means that we should see stronger situational dependence in those societies that value inconsiderateness and lacking sense, which are the liberal societies. So theory can explain why we have this greater situational dependence in certain societies. Could we apply this theory to more things? Oh, yes, we can. And the next we're going to use is to try to use it to explain support for different climate policies. But that is not part of this talk. So I will just say thanks to my fantastic set of collaborators in the Global Social Norms Network, to our research assistant Minna, who has coordinated all of these data collections, Irina, who has run the analysis, Pontus, who co-designed the study, and the Wallenberg Foundation, who paid for it all. Thank you.